ישמורך בכל דרכיך כי מלאך צער ולך ישמורך וישמורך בכל דרכיך השם ישמור צאצך ישמור צאצך ובייך מלאתה ליד העולם השם ישמור צאצך ישמור צאצך ובייך מלאתה ליד העולם.
Good evening! How's everybody doing? It's great to be with you learning on a Monday night. That, of course, was Eitan Katz. We're working our way through his album, Unplugged 3, the songs of Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Monday night? Sharon in New Jersey, Pauline in Chicagoland, Melissa in Great Neck, Guy in Ohio, Gwen in Michigan, Lewis in Northern California, which is Karen in Northern California, Paula in the Great Northwest, Stephen in New Hampshire, Lucy in Minnesota, Yehuda in South Carolina, Bella in Florida, Paula in Chicago, Gisette in Colorado, Shandor in the Bronx, Nancy in North Carolina, Karina, which is Stuart in Florida. Over on the YouTube side, Aoife in Florida, Yitzhak in Kansas City. Welcome, everybody. We are nearing the end of chapter 3 and the challenges that it has posed here in Tractate Kesubos, the 15th volume of the Talmud. Today, we are going to complete our discussion of Mishnah number 4. And then we're going to do Mishnah number 5 and Mishnah number 6 and Mishnah number 7. That's how you know we're getting near the end of the chapter. Very often we have a long discussion on the first Mishnah of the chapter. Usually there's about 8 to 10, 8 to 12, sometimes more, but usually around 8 to 10 Mishnahs in a chapter. And so often we spend the bulk of the chapter on the first one or two, and then toward the end of the chapter we get a bunch of Mishnayos with much less Gemara, much less commentary on them. And that is the case here. Let's get into it. So generally speaking, Tractate Kesubos about the laws of marriage contracts. One of the big distinctions in the marriage contract is the amount that the woman is entitled to as a settlement if the marriage ends through death or divorce. And she's going to have a different entitlement in terms of the minimum value of the marriage contract if she enters the marriage as a virgin or not. Those kinds of concerns were much more important in ancient times. Now, by the way, the ketubah is not so much about a financial settlement. All Jewish couples that get married and have a Jewish marriage have a ketubah or a kesuba, the different pronunciation. But it's much more about the obligations of the spouses toward each other. It's much more of a spiritual document in modern times. Back then, it really was much more of a financial agreement. And this idea that, when women were being married off at a much younger age, that there was an expectation by the groom and the groom's family that she was a virgin, a non-virgin, who had become a non-virgin without having been married and then widowed or divorced. That was considered very, very promiscuous behavior unless she was raped and it was no fault of hers. So that is why the Torah also provided that if a man raped a woman, he had to pay her a fine. In fact, the amount of money that a virgin would receive from the marriage contract when she enters the marriage, that was the penalty, the fine of the rapist. And additionally, he would have to marry her. The rapist would have to marry the girl if she chose to have that marriage. And her father chose, because we're talking here about that stage where she's a young woman, more than a minor, less than a grown woman. So in that situation, she doesn't have to marry the rapist, and probably she wouldn't want to. But if she chose that because it made financial sense for her, let's say in a very poor community where maybe the rapist was a more wealthy person, so then he would never have the right to divorce her, and he would have to support her all the days of his life, as opposed to every other marriage where the husband had the unilateral right to divorce the wife. Okay, so these are some of the concerns that we've been examining. We complete our commentary on Mishnah number 4, again, where we're comparing the rapist and the seducer. So we've been learning now that whereas the rapist and the seducer pay the fine for rendering her not a virgin, that is irrespective of the fact that they also owe damages. The fine is just because you rendered her not a virgin. But if you caused her pain and suffering, if you caused her humiliation, if you caused her degradation or medical damages or loss of livelihood, etc., through the violent act of rape, that's a separate category and you owe damages for that as well. So the difference in terms of those damages, humiliation, they both pay. Pain, maybe they both pay, maybe they don't. But the difference between the rapist and the seducer is the seducer also, violated Torah law for sure. But this young woman was somewhat complicit in that. She consented to this. That's why he's a seducer and not a rapist. To our ear, are we talking about a young woman? She's 12 years old. That's what is defined as a young woman. We would understand this through the lens of statutory rape. And it wouldn't matter whether she consented or not. But people married at a younger age, lived, much shorter lifespans back then. And the concept of statutory rape, didn't exist in that society. So we have to, in our analysis, understand that we're talking about how these laws were enforced 2,000 years ago. And I've repeated this every day through this very difficult journey that we've made through these laws that are, they're so uncomfortable for us that we must separate, the emotional trauma of these kinds of crimes from the analysis that's being done in this context, which is simply about, does the rape fine accrue or not? Do other kinds of damages accrue or not? Are they paid to the woman or to the father? They're not talking about what proof standard do we have for convicting the rapist. We're not talking even about, does he deserve the death penalty? Will he get the death penalty? How do we prove his crime so that he gets the death penalty? That's considered when we're more discussing criminal law. Here we're really talking about the law of fines and damages and how that intersects with a woman later, not with the rapist. I mean, it could be with the rapist, but usually she was raped. Now she's going to go get married, but she's no longer a virgin. And that's why there's this intersection between the law of marital contracts and the law of the rapist and the seducer. We pick this up at the bottom of page 39b. Our daf today is page page 40. Okay, the Mishnah continues. A rapist drinks from his vessel. That's a metaphor. And the seducer does not, meaning he is not obligated to marry the woman he seduced. We had a contrary opinion earlier, but basically the rapist is forced to marry the woman he raped if she wants to be married and her father wants her to be married. The seducer does not necessarily marry that woman. He can, but he's not obligated. Rava from Parzakia, if the seducer doesn't marry her, then he pays the fine. If he does marry her, he doesn't pay the fine because he ends up married to her. The rapist pays the fine and marries. Okay, so the rapist drinks from his vessel. What does this mean? Rava from Parzakia said to Rav Ashi, since the laws of a rapist and a seducer are derived from each other with regard to the sum of the fine, well then, from this matter too, marrying the woman against his will, right, that the rapist must marry the woman whether he wants to or not, so let these laws be derived from each other. Perhaps the seducer is also obligated to marry the woman that he seduced, even though, he didn't want to, right? So like the shotgun wedding type of analogy. So Rav Ashi replied that the verse states with regard to a seducer, he shall pay a dowry for her to be a wife to him. To him means in accordance with his will. Right, so the seducer must pay the fine. He has the option to marry her or not. The rapist must pay the fine. he is obligated to marry her if she wants to marry him. The Mishnah continues, how does the rapist drink from his vessel? What does this mean? The Mishnah proceeds to explain that he is obligated to marry her despite the physical flaws that she might have. Maybe she has a congenital disease. Maybe she's physically deformed. Maybe she has all kinds of things that if he was just kind of a normal guy in the market to marry a girl, he might say, I don't want to marry her because she has these flaws. Well, tough. You should have thought of that before you raped her. Now that you raped her, if she wants to marry you, you must marry her, and those flaws make no difference. The only flaws in her that would make a difference is if she is legally prohibited to marry him, because, for example, she's a mamzeret, right? She was conceived of an adulterous union of her mother. So then a Jewish man cannot marry her. Only a mamzer can marry her. And so then the law of the obligation of the rapist to marry would not apply because he legally cannot marry her. So again, how does the rapist drink from his vessel? He's obligated to marry her despite any physical flaws she might have. However, if the marriage is prohibited either due to the fact that she committed adultery or due to her flawed lineage, like she's a mamzeret, he is not obligated to marry her, and therefore he may not marry her. And Rav Kahana said, I stated this law before Rav Zevid of Nehardea, and I asked him, let the positive mitzvah, and to him she shall be as a wife, right? The rapist must marry if she will have him. Maybe it should come and override the prohibition of marriage to a woman who is forbidden to him. Maybe a Jewish man is not allowed to marry a woman who is a mamzeret, but if he rapes her, then the positive mitzvah to marry the rape victim overrides the prohibition on marrying a mamzeret. That's the proposition here. And here comes the answer. He said to me, where do we say the principle that a positive mitzvah comes and overrides a prohibition? It is in a case where one performs, for example, circumcision of a foreskin that is afflicted with leprosy. Tzara'as. Although there is a prohibition against removing the skin lesion of tzara'as, right? Tzara'as, recall, is the physical manifestation of a spiritual malady. This disease does not exist anymore. The whole spiritual level of the Jewish people has fallen to where we don't have tzara'as, right? We were blessed that when the temple was standing, if people engaged in lashon hara, evil speech, and certain other practices, they might be afflicted with tzara'as. And why would you say that, we don't merit to have such a disease anymore? It sounds great that we don't have it anymore, but that was actually an atonement opportunity. And now we don't have those atonement opportunities anymore. But at any rate, a Torah law is that when you see that lesion on your skin, which you would have a priest come and examine it to see if it was indeed tzara'as, you might think, well, I don't want to be diagnosed with tzara'as. That would be really inconvenient, right? Because then I'm not going to be allowed to go to the temple and bring a sacrifice. I can't go to people's homes. I'm going to be isolated. I only have this one mark. Why don't I just, scrape it off? That's violating a Torah prohibition. But if the tzara'as appears on the end of the foreskin, which is going to be removed in a circumcision, it's illegal to, cut off tzara'as. However, if it's on the end of the foreskin, the positive mitzvah to perform the circumcision overrides the negative prohibition not to remove tzara'as. That's where a positive mitzvah overcomes a negative mitzvah, as it is not possible to fulfill the positive mitzvah without violating the prohibition, the negative mitzvah. However, here, in the case of the rapist, if she says, I do not want him as a husband, is there a positive mitzvah at all? We don't always have that positive mitzvah. The positive mitzvah is only if she wants. Since she might not want, it's not a situation where it always happens. So since in that case, the mitzvah need not be performed, as it is negated when the woman refuses to marry him, it does not, because it is not always a positive mitzvah, it's only sometimes a positive mitzvah, and a sometimes positive mitzvah does not come and override a negative mitzvah. And that's why the positive obligation of the rapist to marry his victim, if she wants to, does not override the negative prohibition against marrying a mamzeret if she happens to be one. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 4. Here comes Mishnah number 5. With regard to an orphan who was betrothed and divorced, right? So we see that in cases of the rape victim, the fine only applies when she's a young woman, so she's no longer a minor, not yet an adult woman, and it says in the Torah, who is not betrothed, which we've learned that it means she was never betrothed. Obviously, it doesn't mean that she's betrothed at the time that she is raped. That would bring its own set of circumstances. So it must be that she wasn't betrothed and then divorced before, because that would have some kind of impact. Because, right, if she's never been betrothed and she's in that young woman stage of her life and she's raped, the rapist must pay the fine. To whom does he pay it? To her father. If she had been betrothed and divorced, the rapist pays it to her. Because the betrothal and divorce, even though she might still be under the authority of her father, it's going to remove her from the authority of her father in terms of receiving the fine for rape. So with regard to an orphan, now we're talking about an orphan. Okay, so there is no father anyway. So that's another reason why if she's raped, she receives the fine. There is no father to receive it. So with regard to an orphan who was betrothed and divorced, Rabbi Elazar says one who rapes her is obligated to pay the fine, as she is a virgin young woman who's now been raped and she's no longer a virgin. And one who seduces her, he is exempt from payment because she is an orphan, or because she was betrothed and divorced, she is independent, and by consenting to the seduction, she forgoes her right to the fine. Whereas, if she wasn't an orphan and she was still under the authority of her father, then when she participated in the seduction that rendered her not a virgin, she didn't have the right to do that, as it were, because at that time, it's like her body wasn't her own. Her body belonged to her father in the sense that he had authority over her. And when she participated in, premarital relations, so rendering her not a virgin and therefore diminishing her value in terms of the father marrying her off, to some prominent family that would have been better for the family. This is ancient customs and traditions, right? You can understand how it was much different back then, and the idea of marrying children was in many ways an economic transaction, for the families that were involved. Almost like more modern times, the way royalty, it had very little had to do with whether the princes and princesses loved each other. It was whether they wanted to make an alliance with a particular nation. It's not at that level, but it's sort of similar. Gemara. Rabbi Bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabbi Elazar stated his opinion in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, his teacher, as with regard to a young woman who was betrothed and then divorced and then raped, Rabbi Akiva said in an earlier Mishna that we read, she is entitled to a fine for rape and the fine is paid to her as opposed to her father. Rabbi Yosef HaGalili says she is not entitled to a fine for rape because she had been betrothed and divorced and then lost the presumptive status of a virgin. So she might get damages for pain and suffering, but not for loss of virginity. And from where do we know that Rabbi Elazar's opinion corresponds to the opinion of his teacher, Rabbi Akiva? From the fact that the Mishnah teaches with regard to an orphan that Rabbi Elazar says one who rapes her is obligated to pay the fine and one who seduces her is exempt from payment. And the Gemara asks, an orphan? That is obvious, as she has no father and is not subject to the authority of anyone else. So clearly the seducer is exempt from payment because she was complicit. Rather, this is what the Mishnah is teaching us, that the legal status of a young woman who was betrothed and divorced, even if her father is alive, is like that of an orphan. Just as with regard to an orphan, payment of the fine is to her, so too, with regard to a young woman who is betrothed and divorced, payment of the fine is to her. That's a little bit surprising, actually, because if she is still a young woman who was betrothed and then divorced, she does return to the authority of her father, who can still now betroth her to a different young man from a different family. So since he still has that authority over her, you might have thought that if she was raped at that stage in her life, that the fine would go to the father and not to her. But this Mishnah teaches us, no, if she had been betrothed and divorced, that renders her like an independent adult woman for the purposes of who gets the fine, and it's her rather than her father. Rabbi Zeres said that Rabbi Bar Shela said that Rav Hamnuna, the elder, said that Rav Ada Bar Ahava said that Rav said. The law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar. And Rav would exclaim about Rabbi Elazar, he is the happiest of sages, as he held that the law was ruled in accordance with his opinion in many instances. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 5. Here we go, Mishnah number 6. What is humiliation? Finally, now we're a little bit off the subject of the fine for rape, which only women in very specific circumstances receive. And now we're talking about humiliation. That's totally different. That's damages, for the actual suffering, one of the types of suffering that the rapist causes the rape victim. And that is completely independent of whether the fine legally qualifies in that situation or not, how old she is, under the authority of her father, etc. If the rapist caused her, public humiliation through the rape, he has to pay this money, whether he owes the fine or not. So what is humiliation? How is the payment for humiliation during rape or seduction assessed? It is all based on the one who humiliated and the one who was humiliated. The price will vary depending on the lineage of the family of the rape victim and the nature of the attacker. How is her degradation assessed? One considers her as though she was a maidservant, meaning a female slave at the time when slavery existed, who was sold in the marketplace. And you would assess how much she was worth in the marketplace before she was raped and how much she is currently worth after the rape or seduction. The sum of the fine is equal for all people, and the principle is any payment that has a fixed sum, the fine, as opposed to the damages for degradation, right? The fine is always the same, 50 sela, which is the same as 200 dinar. Damages for humiliation and degradation varies from person to person, both according to who was the rapist and who was the rape victim. And that is Mishnah number 6. Here comes the Gemara. The Gemara asks, and say that the merciful one said that meaning God, that the payment is 50 sela, right? This is the fine for rape in the Torah. That the fine is 50 sela from all these matters. Maybe you should say that the fine includes damages for humiliation, degradation, and pain, and there are no separate damages. Now, we've been saying, for days, maybe weeks, that no, there's a difference. They are separate. You can be liable for the fine and for damages. But now the Gemara is asking, are we sure that that is true? Maybe the damages for humiliation and degradation are included in the fine. And Rabbi Zera says, no, that cannot be. Why? As they will say, if one engaged in forced intercourse, if one raped the daughter of a king and he pays 50 sela, does one who engaged in forced intercourse with the daughter of a commoner also pay 50 sela? Now, once again, the modern ear freaking out. Are you saying that a rich girl is somehow inherently worth more than a poor girl? That the daughter of a king is somehow worth more as a human being than the daughter of an average Joe Schmo? And the Torah is saying that because at the time that these laws were active, remember, marriage was very much an economic transaction, right? And so a king who is going to marry off his virgin daughter, can marry her off to the son of another king who's going to send a king's dowry, or the dowry of a princess, which maybe in today's money is $100 million. But if the daughter is not a virgin, they might say, then make it $50 million, right? And there's a $50 million difference. Whereas Joe Schmo, he might marry off his virgin daughter and, receive, today's money, $10,000. And if she's not a virgin, maybe it's only $5,000. So you can see that there is a financial difference between the daughter of a commoner and the daughter of a king, not because she is inherently, a better human being. It's just that there's financial impact to these, the financial consequences when these tragedies happen. So Abaye said to him, well, that is not a decisive argument, as if so, with regard to a Canaanite slave killed by an ox, the Torah says that the owner of the ox pays the master of the slave 30 silver selah. And there too, they could say, well, are you going to pay the same 30 silver selah just because, any time that a Canaanite slave is gored and killed by an ox belonging to a Jew? Well, what if, right, so there are two Jews involved. One owns an ox, the other owns a slave. And the guy whose ox killed the slave has to pay 30 selah to the one whose slave was killed. Well, but compare two slaves. What if one of them was a diamond cutter? He was a slave, but he happened to be a highly skilled craftsman who was making a lot of money for his master, versus a different slave who, was just, what's the example they gave, who just performs the needle craft of a tailor, which is a much more common skill and is going to earn much less money for the master. So if you're saying that, you would have a different penalty for the rape of a princess versus the rape of a commoner because that's going to have different financial impact for her father, then why wouldn't you say the same vis-a-vis a highly skilled slave or a common slave, who were killed by an ox? Why does the Torah say that the fine for killing a slave by an ox, that your ox gored a slave, is the same amount? It only depends on age and gender, right? Why? So rather, now we're on 40b, Rabbi Zera gave a different proof, right? Because that was problematic. So he said, had two men engaged... Okay, here we go. Had two men engaged in forced intercourse with her, one raped her vaginally and one raped her anally, they will say that if the one who engaged in rape with an untainted virgin pays 50 selah, does the one who engaged in rape with her after she is tainted, for example, that she had engaged in anal intercourse, which there's a debate elsewhere in the Talmud, is a woman who had only had anal intercourse in her life, is she a virgin or not? That's subject to a dispute. One who rapes a virgin pays a 50 selah fine. The second person who rapes her isn't raping a virgin, so presumably he would have some different payment to make. Damages for sure, but maybe not the 50 selah fine for raping a virgin since she's no longer a virgin. So apparently the 50 selah, this is a fixed sum of the fine, while the rest of the payment varies on a case-by-case basis. Meaning the fine for the damages for humiliation. That varies case by case, but the fine is the same. So Abaye said to him, that's no proof, as if so, with regard to a slave as well, they will say, if one whose ox gored a healthy slave pays 30 selah, does one whose ox gored a slave afflicted with boils also pay 30 selah? And rather, Abaye said a different proof. The verse states 50 shekels of silver because he tormented her. These 50 selah are the fine paid because he tormented her, from which it may be inferred that there are the additional payments of humiliation and degradation beyond that sum mentioned in the verse. So Rava said an alternative proof. The verse says, and the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver. For the pleasure of lying with her, he pays 50 selah. From which it may be inferred that there are additional payments of humiliation and degradation beyond payment of the fine. And this is the proof that indeed, when one rapes or seduces a virgin, he may be liable to pay the 50 selah for the fine, but separately, he's going to be liable to pay damages, pain, humiliation, degradation, etc. So the Gemara asks, and say that these additional payments are paid to her. And the Gemara answers that the verse says, between a father and his daughter, being in her young womanhood, right? She's reached puberty, but has not become an adult yet. And she is in her father's house, from which it is derived that all profits, as it were, of her young womanhood go to her father. And so the Gemara asks, however, with regard to that which Rav Huna said, that Rav said, from where is it derived that the handiwork of the daughter goes to her father? Right, that he can hire her out as a child laborer, or he can sell her as a slave, which was a common practice in the ancient world. It is as it is stated, and if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, juxtaposing his daughter to a female slave, just as a maidservant, that's the term here used for female slave, just as a maidservant, her handiwork belongs to her master as she was sold for that purpose, so too a daughter, her handiwork goes to her father. Why do I need this complicated proof? Let him derive it directly from the verse, being in her young womanhood, in her father's house. Rather, this cannot be derived from that verse because that verse is written with regard to the nullification of vows. A young woman is subject to her father's authority with regard to her vows, which he has the right to nullify. And the matter of monetary rights is not addressed in that verse. And if you say, let us derive monetary matters from vows, i.e., just as she is subject to her father's authority with regard to whether he can nullify her vows or not, the same is true with regard to monetary matters, that if she earns money, it goes to the father, and if he sells her, it goes to the father. We do not derive monetary matters from ritual matters. And if you say, well, let us derive that her father receives payment from the law of a fine, the rapist's fine, just as that fine is paid to her father, as explicitly stated in the Torah, so too other payments are also paid to her father. But we do not derive monetary matters from fines, which are very specific, which only exist in a few areas of the law, like the case of the rapist or the seducer. But we don't derive whether damages accrue to her or her father from the law of fines. The payment of a fine is a novel element decreed by the Torah and cannot serve as a paradigm for standard monetary matters. Rather, the Gemara explains that it is reasonable that payments of humiliation and degradation are paid to her father. Why? Because as if he wished to do so, he could give her hand in marriage to a repulsive man or one afflicted with boils, thereby humiliating her. Since her humiliation is under his control, the father, if he was a horrible father, could humiliate his daughter. Therefore, the payment for humiliation is similarly his. The Mishnah continues. How is her degradation assessed? One considers her as though she was a maidservant sold in the marketplace and assess how much she would have been worth beforehand and how much she would be worth currently. So the Gemara asks, how do we assess her value? Shmuel's father said, one estimates the difference between how much a person is willing to give to purchase a virgin maidservant and how much he is willing to give to purchase a non-virgin maidservant to serve him. The Gemara asks, well, with regard to a non-virgin maidservant to serve him, if he purchases her for service rather than as a wife, what difference is there to him whether or not she's a virgin? Rather, the difference between a maidservant who engaged in intercourse and a maidservant who did not engage in intercourse is with regard to how much one is willing to marry her to his slave. Meaning, a man has a bunch of slaves. He's got a slave that he cares about. He wants to, and he's going to have this slave. He's going to marry off. He's going to get a wife for his slave. Now, why would he do that? One reason might be he wants to breed slaves, right? And so it's just for his own profit. But a different reason might be that he has a beloved servant, right? Back then, like slavery was just so much more common, and people even sold themselves into slavery when they accrued debts that they couldn't get out of, and they might end up, it was almost like a master could be very wicked and treat his slaves horribly, but there were also many owners, who were Torah-observant Jews who would never mistreat their slaves and really just treated them like employees. So if you had an employee who was with you for a long time, who did a really good job for you, you might want to reward him. How would you reward him? So that he could have his own family. So you might purchase a slave woman to be a wife to this male slave of yours. And when you do that, how much are you going to spend, right? It's up to you whether you're going to provide him with a virgin wife or not. So depending on how much you want to reward him is sort of how much you might want to spend on this slave that you purchased for him. And So in regard to a slave for whom his master has a sense of satisfaction, and he seeks a virgin for the slave in order to reciprocate. So the difference between the price that the master is willing to pay for each of the maidservants is the degradation that the offender pays the victim. Right, when he rapes her and renders her non-virgin, the amount that her value would be diminished if she hypothetically was sold as a slave is how you would calculate the damages for degradation. That concludes a discussion of Mishnah number 6. Here comes Mishnah number 7. Any place where there is a sale, where there is the ability to sell by a father of his minor daughter as a Hebrew maidservant, there is no fine if she is raped. And any place where there is a fine when a young woman is raped, as opposed to a minor girl, there is no sale by the father. Right? Once she becomes a young woman who's subject to the fine for rape, the father has lost the ability to sell her as a slave. He could only do that while she was a minor. When she's a young woman, he can't do that. And once she becomes an adult woman, he neither receives the fine nor has the right to sell her. That's the Mishnah. Here comes the Gemara. Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, this law in the Mishnah is the statement of Rabbi Meir. But the rabbis say she is entitled to a fine, even where there is a sale. As it is taught in a baraisa, a minor girl from 1 day old until she grows 2 pubic hairs, she is subject to sale. Her father could sell her as a slave, and she is not entitled to a fine if she is raped. From when she grows the 2 pubic hairs and becomes a young woman until she matures into a grown woman, she is entitled to a fine, and she is not subject to sale by her father. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. As Rabbi Meir would state the principle, any place where there is a sale, there is no fine, and any place where there is a fine, there is no sale. But the rabbis who overrule Rabbi Meir say a minor girl from the age of 3 years and 1 day until she matures into a grown woman, if she is raped and rendered a non-virgin, she receives the fine. The Gemara questions the statement of the rabbis in the Baraisa with regard to a girl who's more than 3 years of age. A fine, yes, but sale, no? Do the rabbis maintain that the father cannot sell his minor daughter as a Hebrew maidservant? Rather, amend the text and say she is even entitled to a fine where she is subject to sale. And Rav Chisda said, what is the rationale for the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says either the father can sell her or he receives the fine if she's raped? It is, as the verse says, with regard to a rapist, and the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 selah, and to him she shall be as a wife, and he can never divorce her. And the verse is speaking with regard to one who is legally competent to marry by herself, which means that she must be a young woman and not a minor. And the Gemara asks, and what is the rationale for the opinion of the rabbis? And Reish Lakish said the verse says young woman, na'ara. However, although the term is pronounced na'ara, it is written as nar, without the letter hey at the end, and even a minor girl is indicated by that term. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, get them in. The Gemara relates, Rav Papa, the son of Rav Chanan, from a place called Be Kelochit, heard this law and went and said it before Rav Shimi bar Ashi. And Rav Shimi said to him, you teach this statement concerning that matter. We, based on our traditions, teach it concerning this matter. As Reish Lakish said, one who slanders a minor girl, falsely claiming that she is not a virgin on the wedding night, is exempt from paying the fine, as it is stated, and they shall give them to the father of the young woman, Na'ara. And the verse spoke of a Na'ara, a young woman, not only pronounced, but written in full, indicating that this statement is in effect only with regard to a young woman and not a minor girl. However, in places where the term is written Na'ar, even a minor girl would be included. So Rav Ada bar Ahava strongly objects to this, and the reason is that the Merciful One writes Na'ara with a hey. Is that to say that if that were not the case, I would have said that the law applies even to a minor girl? How is that possible? But isn't it written? And if this matter was true, that the hymen of this young woman was not found intact, that perhaps she had been promiscuous, then they shall remove the young woman to the entrance of her father's house and stone her for her promiscuous behavior. And this verse clearly refers to a young woman old enough to be punished. A minor is not subject to punishment. Rather, here, with regard to the payment of the slanderer, The verse speaks of a na'ara written with a hey, and a minor is excluded. And this is a paradigm from which it may be inferred that in any place that it is stated na'ara without a hey, even a minor girl is indicated. Okay. We're almost done with this chapter. Questions or comments on page 40? It's loading. Here we go. Sharon. Clearly, seduction of a young girl who does not have the maturity to fully understand cannot be comparable to seduction of a mature woman. And that's why the fine applies, and perhaps the humiliation, and the humiliation and degradation as well. A portion of the damages she doesn't get because she was complicit in the act, but most of the damages and the fine do accrue in the case of the seducer, just like the rapist. Lesiuk and Eugenia. What happens if a married man in process of divorce seduces a young woman? If she has a child, is the child a mamzer? It's very interesting. So, first of all, whether the man is married or not is not dispositive, right? You would think. A married man, why? Because under Torah law, a married man could have more than one wife. So when a married man cheats on his wife, he hasn't necessarily, that in itself doesn't create a mamzer. If he sleeps with a single woman, for example, and gets her pregnant, what he ought to do is marry her. That's possible. That's on the table. But a Jewish woman who's married to a Jewish man, so she has a valid marriage under Jewish law, she becomes prohibited to all other men. Now, 1,000 years ago, the law became that a Jewish man can only have one wife, right? There's one husband, one wife. No more like Jacob, who had Rachel and Leah. But that's only since 1,000 years ago that was the official position. Now, even 2,000 years ago, they said the Torah technically permits a man to have multiple wives, but he shouldn't do that. We've seen that elsewhere in the Talmud. But the bottom line is, because under Torah law, he could have multiple wives, he hasn't created a mamzer when he sleeps with a woman just because he's married. A woman who's married, a Jewish woman married to a Jewish man, she's prohibited to all other men. If she has sex with a man who's not her husband, and it's a Jew, and she gets pregnant, so that child is a mamzer. Interestingly, if she cheats on her husband with a non-Jew, it's bad, but that child is not a mamzer. Right? Very interesting. That child is a Jew and not a mamzer. But that's outside the scope of this class. But a mamzer is strictly when a Jewish woman was married to a Jewish man and she slept with some other man and then got pregnant, right? That child is a mamzer. So it's the fact that she's married is what's really important, not that he's married. Bill Aldridge. The way I like to think about the way the Torah handles the, for lack of a better word, class distinctions between commoners and royalty is to go back to my favorite fiction book, The Once and Future King. When Camelot eventually falls, Arthur personally wants to be merciful to Lancelot and Guinevere for their affair, but legally can't because an affair with the royal consort is treason in se, because it challenged the succession. Very good. That's a great example, Bill. Right? There's just more at stake, when the family in question is a royal family, right? Because it has implications, not only financial implications, economic implications, but governmental, international implications when those families get married. In modern times, much less. We almost view, like the royalty as almost like just a celebrity sideshow. Those interesting people who are on the cover of People magazine, because the power of the monarchy doesn't really accrue the way that it used to. But, in olden times, when the king was synonymous with the state, When a king dies and if there is an appointed successor, okay, that's a peaceful transition of power. And if there's not, boom, there's a civil war coming and maybe the whole nation will take sides. And King David himself, there were terrible times in establishing that Solomon would come after him. With Absalom, with Adonijah, with all those sons, especially Absalom, I mean, just terrible stuff was going on, not just within the family, but with national and even international implications. And finally, Lesiuk and Eugenia ask, what if the owner of a slave rapes a virgin female slave? See, that's such a good question, right? So now you're just examining, the society as it was then, right? So let's just put our own, modern, approaches to humanity aside and put ourselves, in ancient times and deal things that they had to deal with the way they would deal with them. So what we have seen about an owner and a slave, right? An owner who injures his slave by putting out her eye or her tooth, if she's a Hebrew maidservant, she goes free. Because he injured her, in that severe way, she goes free. Does rape constitute that kind of injury where he has to free her? Probably not. The fact is he can buy a virgin slave and marry her to his slaves. So it's like under his authority, he takes a virgin and renders her not a virgin. There's no fine paid. She's lost autonomy over herself. Also a big difference between a Hebrew slave and a Canaanite slave. Specifically, the Hebrew slave could only be a slave for 6 years, and it's anticipated that slave will return to being a free person. Whereas a Canaanite slave, you could never free unless there was that weird exception where you injured them. Otherwise, the Canaanite slaves don't go free. In fact, right, when Joshua led the children of Israel into the land, they were supposed to kill all the Canaanites so that they would not, become a problem in future generations and lead the children of Israel, askew and into idolatry and other things. But they didn't do it. Right? And it's almost like, and the Torah foresaw that they wouldn't. That's why there's the law of Canaanite slaves. Although maybe that anticipated that people would be brought in and become Canaanite slaves. At any rate, there was a different law for Canaanite slaves versus Hebrew slaves. So I'm definitely not well versed enough in the law of, the obligations and privileges of a slave owner in ancient times and what they could do with them. But for sure, they could marry them off to each other. And by the way, certainly with a Hebrew slave, you could emancipate them and marry them, right? So you could purchase a Hebrew slave from, let's say, another Jew who owned her, and your purpose in purchasing her is to set her free. It's actually a mitzvah to redeem the captive in that sense, or to marry her yourself. So at the time that she's emancipated, now it's assumed that she's no longer a virgin. So that's another reason why I guess you had the right to sleep with her and even render her a non-virgin when she was your property. But as soon as you free her, then her past, other than removing her legal presumption that she was a virgin, in every other way, she's now a Jew, and you have to treat her, the fact that she was a slave is irrelevant. And you can't probably even talk about it in the same way that you don't talk when a convert, this is still the law, that if somebody converts to Judaism, it is prohibited to remind them that they were once not a Jew. Once they finish their conversion, they're a Jew like every other Jew, full-fledged with every privilege and responsibility of the Jews. And there are similar laws to one who comes into the Jewish community from being a non-Jew or from being a slave, and once emancipated or once converted, they're just a Jew like everybody else. But these kinds of questions are at play in this analysis. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. I believe tomorrow we finish chapter 3. Yes, we finally finished chapter 3. We'll get into chapter 4. It still talks a little bit about the law of the fine, but not so much, about the rape and what happens in the aftermath of the rape, but rather if a fine needs to be paid, who does it get paid to? And so it's going to be much more talking about the relationship between, the nature of the authority of a father over his children. We'll encounter more of that in chapter 4. But right now, we have one more day here in chapter 3. That's tomorrow's daf, page 41. So with God's help, we'll be together again then for page 41 at the regular Tuesday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.